Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time I covered the early disagreements between Johnston and Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Now we move with Johnston to the west. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, or purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Joseph E. Johnston rode with his army through the streets of Richmond, entering that capital city as the savior to the inhabitants who feared that the Union invasion up the peninsula would put them in direct danger. Crowds of men and women gathered to watch the army pass through. They threw their hats in the air and hollered themselves hoarse. A young man remembered the event, and specifically Johnston. He sat his mount as if he had been a part of her, a little bay mare that looked as if she had been specially built to carry him. They were perfectly matched in size, and her step was as proud as his bearing. His uniform from cap to spur, her housings from headstall to shabrack, were in exact conformity to Army regulations. The adulation paid him evidently pleased him. So also did it please the bay filly, whose crested neck, tossing head, cocked tail, and caracoling step made her seem conscious that she was bearing a Caesar and his fortunes. On the peninsula, George McClellan assembled his mammoth force of over 100,000 men. Johnston didn't plan on staying on the peninsula as President Jefferson Davis and General Robert E. Lee wanted. Johnston believed there was no possible way he could withstand the bombardment of heavy siege guns, and with rains beginning to set in, he worried about the possibility of a withdrawal. Every 2 or 3 days he would write to Davis and Lee informing them that he couldn't hold out on the line he then occupied. On April 30th, the first shells from the Union siege guns began to pepper the Confederate position. The next day, Johnston announced to his staff that they would withdraw. He wrote to Davis telling him about the movement, and when Davis replied that the retreat was a surprise, Johnston responded, "I determined to retire because we can do nothing here. The enemy will give us no chance to win. We must lose. By delay, we may ensure the loss of Richmond too. I have explained this to General Lee." The retreat of the Confederate troops would be miserable. On May 2nd, they began moving the wounded and their ammunition trains out of harm's way. Then the infantry would follow. Johnston gave specific instructions about the time and what road each division would take in the retreat, but some officers didn't obey orders, like Daniel Harvey Hill, who waited hours after his appointed time to get his wagons on the road. Pulling back the line to Williamsburg, Johnston found a home to make his headquarters. There, with his aides and Major Edward Porter Alexander, Johnston took off his jacket and discussed the retreat and the likelihood that they would have to fight back against cavalry probes. Johnston grabbed his saber and began to demonstrate the saber tactics for the men. Alexander said he had seen many of the most famous cavaliers, but had never seen a saber whistle and sing like that one. The retreat up the peninsula continued, and along the way Johnston came across a 12-pound Napoleon stuck in the mud. When the lieutenant of the piece surmised that they would have to leave the gun, Johnston said, "Oh no, I reckon not. Let me see what I can do." He waded out in the mire, seized one of the wheel spokes, covered as it was with mud, and called out, "Now boys, all together." The effect was magical, and the next moment the gun jumped clear of the mud hole. Although Johnston kept Lee apprised of his movements, he sporadically informed Davis. Johnston kept pressing for a concentration of his forces to the outskirts of Richmond, meaning to bring Stonewall Jackson from the Shenandoah Valley and Richard Ewell from Fredericksburg, and any forces he could muster in North Carolina. Lee had other plans. Lee dispatched Ewell to Jackson and wanted Jackson to distract the other large Union army near Fredericksburg by operating offensively in the valley. Johnston was unaware of many of these communications, and thus never did know the entire situation as pertaining to all of the forces under his command. The interactions and disagreements between Davis and Johnston only made Johnston more irritable and made him lash out. On May 7th, Union gunboats on the York River landed a few thousand Union soldiers on the peninsula, threatening Johnston's left flank. Johnston told Gustavus Smith to send a brigade to fill out the enemy and then withdraw, pulling the Union troops away from the gunboats' protective guns. Smith assigned this task to John Bell Hood, who commanded a brigade of men. Hood, instead of pulling the Union soldiers away from the river, drove them to the river, coming out on the better end of the engagement. Johnston was furious at Hood going against orders. Johnston asked the young commander, "What would your Texans have done if I had ordered them to charge and drive back the enemy?" Hood replied, I suppose, General, they would have driven them into the river and tried to swim out and capture the gunboats." Johnston didn't want to dampen Hood's enthusiasm, and although he was annoyed, smiled and said, "Teach your Texans that the first duty of a soldier is literally to obey orders." Johnston was more mad than he let on. He began to gallop away with his staff trying to catch up. Not to be outdone, Edward Port Alexander dug his spurs in and caught up to the general. Weaving in and out of the wagons and ambulances that blocked the road, Johnston kept up a great speed, and when an ambulance attempted to get out of the way of the riders, he inadvertently cornered the general and forced him to rein up his horse. Johnston was furious, cursing the man. He looked over to Alexander and said, "Give me a pistol, and let me kill this infernal blankety-blank." Alexander had to pretend not to have a pistol to save the man's life. The retreat continued, and during it, Davis and Lee met with Johnston to discuss strategy. Johnston outlined his plan. He would fight defensively until the Federals gave him an opening to launch an attack. By mid-May, McClellan was providing the opening. Johnston and his army had retreated all the way to the gates of Richmond, and McClellan was moving his army around, placing 2 corps across the Chickahominy River, while the rest of the army was on the other side of the river. This isolated group provided Johnston with the opportunity to launch his assault. Those Federal corps were dug in and around a crossroads known as 7 Pines because of the 7 loblolly pines that stood in a row at the crossroads. Johnston would assemble 3 divisions to attack the Federal corps, those under James Longstreet, D.H. Hill, and Benjamin Huger. Unfortunately for Johnston, his orders were vague, and when he issued orders to those division commanders, he didn't explain what their overall role was in the engagement, just what they would be doing, which led to confusion as to what would precipitate their own attacks. Johnston placed Longstreet in command of the engagement. Because of the vague orders, only a small fraction of the troops chosen to attack actually made an attack at all. After sending multiple staffers to search for Longstreet, one finally made it back to Johnston and reported that the battle was underway. It was now after 2:30, and to complete the battle plan, Johnston would personally lead Chase Whiting's division to slam into the Union right flank. However, the Confederate battle line under Longstreet wasn't where Johnston believed it to be, and so the reinforcements and attack didn't yield any great result. What did result was Confederate brigades assaulting a heavily fortified Union position and being thrown back. It was getting late, and Johnston decided to call off any more attacks and renew the assaults in the morning. Johnston was watching the battle wind down from atop a small rise when he noticed one of his staffers dodging bullets that were zipping past them. Johnston informed him with a smile, "Colonel, there is no use dodging. When you hear them, they have passed." Almost as soon as the words came out of his mouth, a bullet slammed into his shoulder. It was a minor wound, and Johnston didn't even dismount after it hit him. But then an artillery shell exploded nearby, and pieces of the projectile hit him in the chest and in the thigh. He fell hard from his horse, and many thought he had been killed outright. Then he was put on a litter and carried to a hospital. The muddy road made the soldiers carrying him slip and fall, dropping the wounded general, leading him to cry out every time a litter-bearer lost his footing. They carried him past the president, who bent down to address the wounded general. Johnston opened his eyes and grasped the president's hand. Davis asked if there was anything he could do. Johnston shook his head and said he didn't know how serious the wound was, but he thought that a shell fragment injured his spine. The litter-bearers continued taking the general to the rear, but Johnston was conscious enough to remember his pistols and his sword, especially his sword, which had been left on the field. One of his staffers, Drury Armistead, volunteered to go back and get them. When he returned with the pistols and sword, Johnston was so grateful he gave Armistead one of his pistols. With the general injured, Davis turned to Robert E. Lee and placed him in command of Johnston's army. Lee wouldn't renew the attacks, believing the opportunity was gone. Johnston would have been within reason to blame Longstreet for the lost opportunity, but Johnston never did blame him. He blamed Benjamin Huger, and Huger's military career suffered because of the criticism. Edward Porter Alexander still blamed Longstreet for the horrible delay and the misunderstanding of orders, saying that Longstreet's actions utterly wrecked and ruined Johnston's excellent and simple plan. However, ultimate blame goes to Johnston for his confusing orders and his inability to convey his orders to his subordinates. The reason that Johnston didn't blame Longstreet was probably because he was protecting him. As one of Johnston's biographers put it, Johnston even went so far as to ask Gustavus Smith to change his official report by omitting all references to Longstreet's movements. He acknowledged to Smith that his draft report contained references to subjects which I never intended to make generally known, specifically the misunderstanding between Longstreet and myself in regard to the direction of his division. He did not feel any difficulty in asking Smith to remove the offending passages, for, as he asserted, these matters concern Longstreet and myself alone. At the same time, Johnston publicly praised Longstreet for his skill, vigor, and decision during the battle, and endorsed Longstreet's criticism of Huger. Huger wrote to Johnston as he was convalescing in Richmond and demanded for Johnston to correct the errors in his report, criticizing his actions, and allowing Longstreet to get away without taking any blame. Huger even asked the president to open up a court of inquiry so he could clear his name. Davis and Johnston allowed the situation to drop, and Huger never got his day in court. As one of Johnston's biographers stated, the Battle of Seven Pines went down in Confederate lore as a victory, an incomplete victory to be sure, but a victory nonetheless. It was not. Johnston had bungled a splendid opportunity. He had failed to communicate his plans adequately to his subordinates. He had failed to keep track of the developing battle, and after he had taken charge personally of the battle on the left, he had led his men into a hornet's nest. Worse than all these errors, in the coming weeks and months, he would falsify his written reports to shield a favored subordinate. G.W. Smith's final verdict was that there is but little to commend General Johnston's practical management of the Army May 31st, and the same may be said in regard to the accounts he has given on these events. Johnston was taken to a home in Richmond to get medical attention. The shoulder wound hadn't hit bone, and hit nothing vital, but the shrapnel to his chest broke multiple ribs. It would take months for him to recover. As he recuperated, he was visited by Texas Senator Louis T. Wigfall and his wife Charlotte. Charlotte waited in the carriage as the senator entered the home that acted as Johnston's hospital, and Lydia Johnston went out to sit with Charlotte. The two couples became fast friends as Wigfall frequently visited Johnston. They became such good friends that the Wigfalls invited the Johnstons to stay with them while Joe recovered. This would end up being another divide in the rivalry between President Davis and Johnston, because Wigfall was one of the outspoken members of the Confederate Congress against the president, and by moving in with Wigfall, it signaled to Davis that Johnston was solidly in the anti-Davis camp of the Confederate government. Because Johnston was associated with Wigfall, he became associated with two other anti-Davis politicians, Henry S. Foote of Tennessee and William Lowndes Yancey of Alabama. Foote, a former Unionist, and Yancey, a fire-eating secessionist, patched up their friendship, and a celebratory breakfast was held in honor of the reconciliation. About noon, with the party members gathered around drinking champagne ran through the blockade, Yancey told Johnston to remain seated. Then Yancey stood and said, "This toast is to be drunk standing. Gentlemen, let us drink to the health of the only man who can save the Confederacy, General Joseph E. Johnston." Johnston rose from his seat and said, "Mr. Yancey, the man you describe is now in the field, in the person of General Robert E. Lee. I will drink to his health." It was now November 1862, and Lee had beaten back McClellan from the gates of Richmond and struck north, delivering another victory at the Battle of Second Manassas. Then, following that victory, Lee invaded the north, fighting the Battle of Antietam. Although Antietam wasn't a victory for Lee, that general star was rising fast in the minds of most Confederates. On November 12, 1862, Johnston reported for active duty to the Secretary of War, George Randolph, but where to put him? Lee's successes made taking over the Army of Northern Virginia impossible, but there were basically four armies operating west of the Appalachian Mountains: Edmund Kirby Smith in East Tennessee, Braxton Bragg with the Principal Field Army, also stationed in East Tennessee, John C. Pemberton in and around Vicksburg, and Theophilus Holmes in the Trans-Mississippi West. Johnston proposed that the Confederacy link Pemberton and Holmes together to give mutual support and combine the armies of Bragg and Smith. Johnston wrote up his suggestion and brought it to Randolph, who read the letter, then brought out another letter from himself saying the exact same thing. This signaled to Johnston that it wasn't the Secretary of War's policy keeping these armies separated, but Davis, who had decided against such a policy. Randolph would resign a few days later over the disagreements with Davis. On November 24, 1862, Johnston left Richmond for Tennessee and the Western Theater. He was to take command of all the armies between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, as far north as Kentucky and as far south as the Gulf of Mexico. He basically didn't have a command. It was his job to shuttle troops around the department as needed, but any command was better than no command to Johnston. One of Johnston's biographers explained the ambiguous situation. Davis and Samuel Cooper assumed that Johnston would exercise personal command of either Western army whenever he was present, but Johnston's sense of decorum, as well as his sense of justice, would not allow him to supersede an army commander. It would also require him to assume the day-to-day management of an army without having the day-to-day knowledge of its inner workings. Johnston's role in either army would be more like that of a visitor, at best an advisor, at worst a supernumerary. In addition to the confusion of command, army commanders sent the reports to Richmond, not Johnston. In reality, Johnston commanded nothing. Johnston was in Tennessee by December and found Bragg's Army of Tennessee encamped at Murfreesboro, Tennessee. The Union Army of the Cumberland under William S. Rosecrans lay just 20 miles or so from there in Nashville. Johnston stayed a week with that army and then headed back to Chattanooga, where Lydia had set up house. Johnston was greeted by Davis, who came west to see the situation for himself. Pemberton in Mississippi was under dire straits as Ulysses S. Grant's forces began probing through Mississippi and down the Mississippi River. Davis wanted Pemberton reinforced, but Holmes in Arkansas had too few troops, and they were spread out over the state, keeping Arkansans from feeling as though they were abandoned by the Confederacy, and Davis was unwilling to order Holmes to send reinforcements. Johnston argued for Holmes to send troops, not Bragg, who was already outnumbered in Middle Tennessee. Davis and Johnston went to Bragg's army, and Davis was satisfied that the Union army at Nashville would remain passive, so he sent around 10,000 men from that army to reinforce Pemberton, against Johnston's wishes. Davis and Johnston would travel to Vicksburg as Rosecrans moved his Army of the Cumberland out of Nashville to attack Bragg. The President and the General inspected Vicksburg and its defenses, then Davis made a speech in Jackson. On this journey together, Johnston tried to convince the President to unite Holmes and Pemberton to defeat Grant, because taking any more troops from Bragg threatened to lose all of Tennessee. When the Battle of Stone's River resulted in a Confederate defeat, Johnston's situation changed. Pemberton's position was secured by the victory at Holly Springs and sending Grant's forces back into Tennessee. But now Bragg retreated and was in a precarious situation if the Union Army pursued. Exasperated over the responsibility, but lack of authority, Johnston asked to be relieved of command twice, but Davis refused. The defeat at Stone's River riled up more anti-Bragg sentiment in the Army of Tennessee. Both of Bragg's corps commanders, Leonidas Polk and William Hardee, renewed their assertions that Bragg was unfit for command. Davis dispatched Johnston to the Army of Tennessee to see if the situation was as bad as they reported. This brought Johnston into a dilemma. His sense of honor wouldn't allow him to advocate for the removal of a general who he stood the best chance of replacing if that general was removed. He desired the position as commander of the Army of Tennessee, but his personal honor forbade him from advocating for Bragg's removal. He wrote to the President, "I am glad to find that your confidence in General Bragg is unshaken. My own is confirmed by his recent operations, which, in my opinion, evince great vigor and skill. It would be very unfortunate to remove him at this juncture, when he has just earned, if not won, the gratitude of the country." Johnston approved of Bragg's conduct during the Battle of Stone's River, and probably blamed the loss on Davis's insistence that troops be sent from Bragg's command and sent to Vicksburg. Secretary of War James Seddon and Davis both asked Johnston to stay on as commander of the army, but employ Bragg as a chief of staff to spare Bragg the embarrassment of being entirely removed from the army. Johnston refused on the basis of his honor. Seddon and Davis argued with Johnston, saying, "I do not think your personal honor is involved, and make the sacrifice of your honorable delicacy to the importance of the occasion and the greatness of our cause." Johnston wouldn't remove Bragg. The position Johnston occupied in early 1863 was filled with boredom. He complained of doing next to nothing, and asked Wigfall if he could find him a better position. Although a change would mean moving to a different location, Lydia, always accompanying her husband, said to her friend Charlotte, "I am not sorry to go anywhere to be a little nearer him." Johnston envied Robert E. Lee's command and thought about scenarios that would bring him back in command of the Army of Northern Virginia. He wrote to Wigfall, "I am told that the President and Secretary of War think they have given me the highest military position in the Confederacy. If they so regard it, might not our highest military officer to occupy it?" It seems to me that principle would bring Lee here. I might then, with great propriety, be placed in my old command." When Johnston heard about Lee's victory at Fredericksburg, when Union General Ambrose Burnside flung troops against Lee's defenses, Johnston responded, "What luck some people have. Nobody will ever come to attack me in such a place." On March 9th, Davis called Bragg to Richmond for a consultation, and Johnston temporarily took command of the Army of Tennessee. But when Johnston arrived at Tullahoma, the winter camp of the army, Bragg informed him that he couldn't go to Richmond because Mrs. Bragg was sick. Johnston told him to postpone the trip, and a weird limbo state became the norm, as Bragg wasn't gone, but Johnston was basically in command. When Mrs. Bragg became well enough, Bragg prepared to go to Richmond, but Johnston became ill, suffering greatly from his wounds, which hadn't completely healed, and the constant travel irritated them. So Bragg remained with the army, as Johnston technically commanded from his sickbed. Johnston was again depressed at being placed as the commander of the Department of the West. His understanding of what a general should be was to lead armies at the front, not coordinate armies from a war room. That wasn't his style. For all of the criticism against Johnston's strategic and tactical visions, he was great at inspiring soldiers, like his time in Mexico and Florida, and at the Battle of First Manassas. This new way of conducting war did not mesh with his ideas of what warfare looked like. May 9, 1863 saw Johnston receiving an all-important telegram from Secretary of War James Seddon to report immediately to Mississippi and take command of the forces there. Ulysses S. Grant and his Army of the Tennessee was closing in on Vicksburg, Mississippi, and the Confederate garrison at the important Mississippi town needed all the help it could get. Johnston arrived at Jackson, Mississippi on May 13th. As soon as he arrived, he witnessed wounded soldiers being brought into the city from the fight the day before at Raymond. Tens of thousands of Union soldiers were on the east side of the river and pushing east toward Jackson. Johnston wired the Secretary of War to say, "I have arrived this evening, finding the enemy's force between this and General Pemberton, cutting off communication. I am too late." Johnston only possessed 6,000 men at Jackson, but he was expected to receive 5,000 more troops soon. He couldn't cut his way to Pemberton, but it was possible for Pemberton to cut his way to Jackson. Pemberton had around 30,000 troops combined, and if he linked up with Johnston, they stood a chance of fending off Grant's army, but Pemberton wouldn't comply. Historians have suggested that Pemberton's northern berth made people question his loyalty, and thus he felt he couldn't abandon the city because people would declare him a traitor to the South. Plus, Pemberton knew that Davis's orders to him the whole time he commanded in Mississippi was that he must hold Vicksburg at all hazards. Pemberton wouldn't give it up. Instead of attacking part of Grant's force, he moved south to cut Grant's supply line, disobeying Johnston's orders. In Jackson, Johnston prepared his defenses, and on May 14th, Grant attacked the city, extending his lines to overlap the flanks of the Confederate defenders. As the Confederate artillerymen kept up a continuous fire, Johnston pulled his troops out of the city and moved toward Canton, Mississippi. Grant didn't pursue. The Union conqueror slept in the same bed at the Bowman House Hotel that Johnston had slept in the night before, and no doubt slept better.